stand because my voice is terrible. So just to welcome you, only got the last 30 seconds. And I'll pass it on to Emily here to organize the conversation. But very happy to have you on this very important topic because I guess the IFIs have a particular role to play in this game. But we're glad to have this Reynolds Committee conversation over here. I think that's the first together in Paris. So
yes, that's correct. BWC's first event here in Paris. Want to thank Thierry very much for graciously offering this venue, this beautiful space to us, and hosting today's event. Even with the voice, very much appreciate you being here and kicking us off. Also want to thank all of you for attending. Really looking forward to a fruitful and productive conversation. I think as many of us have already discussed, we are missing a few around the table. Several got stuck at the summit and are unable to leave the security perimeter this morning with President Macron giving his speech. So we're a few short, but nonetheless, I think we'll have a very productive conversation today. And I don't think anyone will be upset if we end a bit early because we have a few less people to speak. So thank you very much for joining. And also I want to thank Creon Butler, who I will introduce here shortly. He has contributed a significant amount of time to some of the work that we will be presenting here today and seeking feedback on. So I just want to thank him very much for his time and effort and commitment to this work so far. And unfortunately, Franny Lodier, who was going to present our multilateral reform work, is one of the people who is stuck on site at the summit. I will do my best to stand in. I think we have some good discussion questions teed up here to be able to discuss that work and get some valuable input from you all. So welcome and thank you. And just to give sort of a high level, overview of sort of what our objectives are for the roundtable today. Of course, we are here alongside the Summit for a New Financial Pact, and we are discussing issues here today that are on the agenda of the official summit, and namely, how do we create an international financial architecture and multilateral institutions that can best serve a new era of global growth and a new era of global challenges. So our objective here today is to discuss two of BWC's work streams in this regard. One is a working group we have on multilateral reform, where we're asking very broad, systemic, strategic questions about what should our international financial architecture look like for a new era and new problems going forward. So we'll get some input on that. And then we're also going to look at a draft of our climate and energy transition finance work, as I mentioned, that Creon has put a lot of time into. And we're going to want to seek feedback on the draft itself and some of the recommendations that we've put forth. So wanting some input on our multilateral reform work, which we haven't quite gotten off the ground yet. So hoping to get some input to inform that draft, and then hoping to get some feedback on the climate and energy finance work, where we do have some ideas put forth. So with that, I think just to kind of give a bit of a high-level overview of the multilateral reform work before I pass it over to Creon to dive into the climate-specific issues. The multilateral reform working group is really looking at how do we enable the global south to be a driver of economic growth in the decades ahead, given the current macro environment and some of the financial constraints in advanced economies. So how do we think about positioning the international financial institutions to enable the global south to deliver global growth? And simultaneously, how do we address issues related to the global commons or global public goods, as they're often referred to? So, increasingly challenges are cross-border and global, such as climate pandemics, and technology. That's broadly what the multilateral reform working group is looking at. We're going to divide that work into two phases. So you all have the issue note in front of you. There's a lot of meat there and there's a lot to tackle. We're looking at dividing that into two phases. The first phase will focus on the MDB system. So what would a fit for purpose MDB system look like to address these challenges going forward? The second phase will look at the international financial architecture, the international financial system, I should say. So the IMF, the role of the IMF, the role of the BIS and FSB in terms of providing macro surveillance, in terms of providing rules of the road, in terms of providing liquidity and financing. So we're kind of going to bifurcate them into those two different phases of work. First, tackling the MDB system work, which we are looking to do between now and October, and we will present our report at the IMF World Bank meetings in Marrakesh in October. So those are the issues that we want to focus on here today, focus the conversation on here today in terms of the multilateral reform work, is really looking at the MDB system. So some of the key questions there is, do the MDBs, does the World Bank and the MDBs, do they have the right mandate to deliver financing in this new era? What's the right balance between poverty reduction and addressing global challenges and global public goods? Should the MDBs be more oriented towards lending, or should they be more oriented towards establishing broader policy guidance and rules of the road? What's the right balance there? Additionally, when we're thinking about the MDBs on the financing side, especially, it's clear that, we're going to need to mobilize more private finance to address these challenges. So what would repurposed MDBs look like in terms of being able to better mobilize and crowd in private sector finance? I mean, should they move to more of a risk mitigation model in this regard rather than being focused directly on lending as they are now? So that's one of the questions that we want to put on the table today. So I think I'll stop there. That's enough to chew on for the multilateral reform work. Those are some of the broad questions we want to look at. And then we want to specifically focus today on the issue of climate as well. And how do we look at the global challenge of climate change and financing the transition to net zero? And what's the role of the MDBs in doing that? And so with that, I will turn it over to Creon Butler from Chatham House, who, as I said, has been really leading our work together with Afsane Beschloss in this regard. And he's going to present our paper, and then we will open it up to get input from everyone after that. So Creon, over to you.
Emily, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to present the conclusions from this brief. I think I've only got 10 minutes and there's 7 recommendations, so this is going to be quite speedy. And this is from the Bretton Woods Committee Climate and Energy Transition Finance Project Team. As Emily said, I co-chair this with Afsane Beschloss, and I'm very grateful to her for all her work, as well as her colleague Nate Rawlins, the members of the project team, and also the secretariat for the Bretton Woods Committee. The other thing, as Emily has said, is that this is work in progress, and in particular, there's additional work we want to do on one specific proposal, which is around the idea of a new financing vehicle within the bank, a climate bank within the bank, but we'll come to that shortly. So let me start, perhaps, first of all, with 3 overview points. And I think the most crucial one is that very early on, the project team defined the question we wanted to address as how do we close the vast climate finance gap for both adaptation and mitigation. And in this brief, as Emily was saying, we're focusing specifically on the MDBs. And there are many estimates as to the scale of the gap. The one I use most frequently is that we need an additional $2.4 trillion a year in investment in low-income and emerging economies, not including China, by 2030. And this is, as I said, for both adaptation and mitigation. Second overview point is the methodology we took, which was essentially to look at all the things that the MDBs currently do, which is quite a wide range of things, And then to consider whether these activities should be scaled up or reformed in some way, or whether they're entirely new things that the MDBs should do in response to this financing gap. Thirdly, it took also early on the view that the MDBs cannot close the gap on their own, although at times, sometimes people speak as if that is something that should be attempted. It's simply too vast, and there are many other actors, particularly the private sector, who have to play a very central role in this. We also view that scaling their contribution on climate finance should not come at the expense of other things that they need to do and currently do and are being relied on to do. And also that they need to play a strong role in both adaptation and mitigation. So moving to the, as I said, 7 recommendations. The first one was actually to say the traditional model of the MDBs for both raising public finance and then using it, both in project lending, but also policy reform, has a great deal to be said to it. And so the first priority should be to scale this up. And that's through, notwithstanding the opposition in some parts of the world, getting shareholders to contribute more paid-in capital, but also making more efficient use of the paid-in capital that the banks currently have, and potentially developing a new financing vehicle within the bank. I mean, it is much of the debate has been about blended finance and so on, and I think it's important to remember that to some extent we got into that because of the perceived block on increasing the capital in the MDBs themselves. I think it's important not to lose sight of that. That's an important thing to do. Okay. Secondly, we also took the view that the MDBs need dramatically to speed up the pace of their lending, particularly for project loans. And in the brief, we argued that that speed should be increased from what can be between 5 and 10 years now, from inception to disbursement, to an average of 12 to 18 months, which is a considerable change, but nonetheless justified by the circumstances that we face. Thirdly, we agreed that it would make sense for the bank and possibly other MDBs to set up a new funding vehicle. And this is what's described as a climate bank within the bank. And the focus of this would add a number of things. Firstly, it would have a very strong focus on what you could kind of characterize in quotes as pure climate lending, as opposed to the other things the bank does, which may have co-benefits for climate change, but also has many other goals as well. This would be a way of prioritizing, giving greater priority to the area. It would be a way of quickly introducing faster loan disbursement procedures and mechanisms, things that could ultimately be done for the bank as a whole, but given the urgency in climate finance, it makes sense to do it quickly in this space. And potentially, it could also ease the constraints currently on the MDBs through particularly the bank group, start to maintain the AAA rating. As I say, we've done further work on this, which we've not yet included in the brief, but it's something we could talk about further. The other thing that this new bank could do would be a place to introduce a comprehensive database of climate and energy transition projects ranked by return, which, as Sam has pointed out, is something the private sector very much wants to have and urgently needs. Fourth recommendation is that we want the MDBs to do more to help their clients manage climate risks, and particularly through doing more of their own lending in local currency lending. This is something that TCX has spoken about a lot, and I think there is a strong case for that. Essentially, if a country is lending more in local currency, it faces a major climate shock, which leads to its currency being devalued. It doesn't immediately lead to a much bigger burden in its external debt. Fifth area is that we do think the MDBs should do more in sharing financial risks with the private sector through guarantees and other kinds of risk-sharing arrangements. This is actually going to be the focus of the second brief in terms of exactly how that should happen. But there are two, and I think this is where there's further discussion to happen in the group. I'm at one probably end of the spectrum, and there are others at the other end. But I think it's very important that in doing this risk sharing, we make sure that we are using that scarce international public finance in the most effective way possible. So, you could use it in traditional bank activities, leveraging in private finance by improving the policy framework and so on, or you could use it in a financial risk sharing arrangement with the private sector, which may be a lot faster, but also has risks in terms of way in which you may end up subsidizing the private sector, which is not really what to do. But this is an area we want to develop using a number of examples and develop a framework for this. Sixth area is that the MDB should boost their role both in terms of international public finance, but also private finance, climate finance, in enhancing transparency, accountability, and civil society participation. And the point underlying this is that you could generate a vast amount of additional climate finance, but if you lose a lot of it, either it doesn't do what it's intended to do, or it's lost through corruption or other means, we could fail in our overall goal. And we've only got one chance to do this. And then the final and seventh point, at which point I can stop for the discussion, is around the coordination of the MDBs and the IFIs. They are absolutely central in climate finance. They do need to coordinate their activities much more, and we think they should develop a high-level committee, probably at first deputy managing director level in the IMF bank, and meet quarterly to focus on the issue as an existential threat. There we go.
Thank you, Kriyan. At this point, I will draw your attention to the discussion questions that we've included in the packet, but I think that we have laid out enough here for everyone to respond to. So I'll ask that if you would like to weigh in and respond, maybe just put your name tag up like this so I can see who would like to would like to speak. I cannot see names, so I'll ask that you do please introduce yourself to the group when you are ready to comment. At this stage, maybe I'll turn it over to our host, Thierry. I know you have limited voice capacity, but you are working in this space day in and day out, and I'm sure have some comments that you'd like to share with the group. So turn it to you first.
Yes, indeed. And I totally support these recommendation with a few additional comments. The lending versus risk mitigation is a sort of debate that the MDBs have had for quite a long time. And in fact, for most of them, it's zero risk mitigation and 100% lending. And that's what their board, their KPIs is asking them to do, because they're all about volume. And today they have, for most of them, there are a few exceptions, no private sector mobilization as a KPI with risk mitigation. So we have to be aware of that. And it's something that is quite ingrained in those institutions and very difficult to change, let alone that their shareholders are giving them contradictory instructions in that matter. I was actually yesterday discussing the efficiency of mobilization of loans don't mobilize. Risk sharing does mobilize with other issues that are, to take the example, since MIGA is here, the most efficient mobilization tool today is MIGA. However, MIGA lacks a little bit of liquidity to make sure that these things can fit, especially for lending and banks, into Basel compliance and things like that. So we still have limitation in terms of scaling up, let alone that MIGA doesn't have a super balance sheet. And we've been pleading for a green MIGA for climate finance for about 10 years, but it hasn't happened yet with new capital. You should be pleased. So, and I think the balancing act is there. There's been, on the positive side, quite an increased coordination amongst MDBs. When I see in Africa, MDBs and DFIs, they are now coordinated in terms of project preparation and really developing their understanding of projects. And Françoise is here. She can talk about how IFC, all the European DFIs work together. One takes the lead, does the due diligence for all of them. It took a while to get there, but it has brought some efficiencies. Generally, this lending process and due diligence process is very much focused on climate. And this is where I'm a bit ambivalent in terms of creating specific climate instrument and vehicle, because it's and it goes from 100% to 20% if you want. If you talk to the European Investment Bank, everything is climate. Actually, that's probably a problem in terms of their financing the development of the emerging economies, because their criteria are quite stringent and almost exceeding the expectations of the EU taxonomy, which is not quite relevant for emerging markets. But that's my personal comment on this issue. But for all of them, because they are governments, and I think about the European ones, and in all these MDBs, you have a fairly strong European shareholding. Climate has become a cross-cutting issue, and so while increasing this climate finance power with a vehicle, we have to be careful about not, I would say in French, déshabiller Paul pour habiller Pierre. But I don't have the English version of that one.
Robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah. So, I mean, all that to say, I think that your recommendations are quite right on point. But my experience over years of having participated in many MDB coordination groups with private sector at Davos, everywhere, until the shareholders are actually in agreement in terms of where to go, I think we'll have a problem. I am very much encouraged by the first signal of the new president of the World Bank, which seems to be very much focused on private sector mobilization. And I understand that there is somehow a paper for consultation going around in terms of the policy. And he's actually taken the time, directly or indirectly, to ask a number of private sector people that are involved in the emerging markets to give their feedback on how IFC works, on how BICA works, and the different. We didn't all say very good things. So, I mean, I'll leave it there. I don't want to dwell on this, but thank you for your opinion.
Thank you, Thierry. I think those are really wonderful kind of opening comments to open it up to the rest of the group. So, as I said, please, if you can, just turn your card up so I can see who would like to speak. I see one down there, and yes, if you please introduce yourself, go ahead. Thank you.
Nandita Prashad from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So one of the MDBs that is being heavily discussed. And thank you for this very structured and very clear set of recommendations. And I'm just going to give you a few very quick reactions. And I think some of them mirror what Thierry said as well. So just on a couple of the questions, the trade-offs, right? The way we look at the energy transition is it's really an opportunity. And that's the narrative that we need to use when we're working in the developing world. And we really find it far less useful to call it a global public good or something they're doing for the world, but it needs to be about something we're doing for them. And this is, we're actually seeing the benefits of that narrative. More and more developing countries are seeing this opportunity, a real opportunity to have affordable, clean, and quick energy to meet their growing needs, to be able to transform their manufacturing and export sectors. And this, I think, is very, very key that we continue to push the green and the energy transition as something that is going to deliver against the SDGs and against prosperity for the people in the developing world. So I really think that we really shouldn't be talking about the trade-offs, but really how do we create opportunities out of this? My second point is there was a question about whether MDBs should be doing more lending or more policy or more mobilization. And my response to that is all of the above. We need to increase our capacity to finance more. And I think that's what, if Rani was here, would have presented through her CAF review. It's really highlighting how this can be done and how much more we need to do. We need to continue to work across the public and the private sector. And we need to then leverage what we are doing to shift the dial on the policy and the regulatory side to actually create the pipeline of bankable projects that are needed to crowd in the private sector, because we fully agree we're not going to meet any of these challenges without the private sector. But while we're all aware that there's a lot of money out there, there's no shortage of money. There's a shortage of projects, particularly in the developing world, and there is a real need for MDBs. We're doing some of it now, but to really scale up on what we're doing to prepare projects and to be able to crowd in the private sector. Cannot agree more. We need to be more efficient. I think Thierry suffers more, like many of our clients do, with the multiple requirements of working with MDBs. We need to harmonize our standards. We need to be far, far, far more efficient in how we work as a system together. But again, repeating what Thierry said, that's not a discussion to have with us. That's a discussion to have in our capitals and with our shareholders. And frankly, it's preaching to the converted here among the MDBs, but it's our capitals that have different requirements of different institutions. They don't speak with the same voice. I can tell you, my procurement rules, my environmental standards are not the same as the EIB. They're not the same as the IFC. They're not the same as the World Bank. So this is a real issue that we need to resolve, but it can't be resolved at the MDBs or even at our boards. It's got to be the shareholders. And then finally, a quick reaction on this idea of a climate bank. I'm sorry, I don't agree. We have enough banks, enough institutions, enough funds. If anything, I think the space is getting more confusing, it's almost sort of diluting what we need to do because it's getting so proliferated with so many institutions and ideas. Instead, I think what we need to do is looking at how we can make what we have work a lot better. I'm looking at Ayan there at the end of the table, who has had her experience, say, at the GCF. The GCF, in principle, is a great institution. It's about to get a replenishment of billions. But how do we make an institution like that more efficient? That's what we need to focus on. New leadership coming in, a new replenishment. Let's make it work better rather than trying to create yet another institution.
Rather than 5 years to disperse.
Exactly. And we have institutions that do work well. Thierry would agree. We have the Global Infrastructure Facility at the World Bank. We think that works very well. Let's scale it up. Let's give it more resources and let's put it to work. So I think I'm going to stop there, but my view on the new institution is let's focus on making the ones we have work better.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for those comments. I think this is exactly, as Kriya knows, what we've been debating with the working group internally on sort of this bank within a bank idea. Is this adding more complexity to the system that actually needs more efficiency and streamlining? So key question to put on the table. Yes, Ayan, please go ahead.
Ayan Adam, I am the CEO of AFC Capital Partners, representing Samaila here. I just wanted to react to two things. One is the issue of bankable pipeline. I think there is also a mismatch between people who have pipelines and the people with the money. And so, our institution, we have humongous pipeline and we do develop projects at the AFC. So actually it's the dearth of capital that doesn't reach. So while I do like the way Jeff works, and I've been at the World Bank, I've been at GCF, as you know, CDC, and now at AFC, the reality is that the people that are closest to the projects and people who are doing PDs do not have money. Jeff is a closed system to most institutions. There's a lot of smaller private sector players that are actually generating a lot of projects. I think we work with Meridian a lot on the AFC side. So I think the early stage equity to de-risk some of these projects that are sustainable, it's an absent instrument. And I just don't feel like the MDBs will become so big are actually the best channels of that early stage equity anymore. So I think what we need to do is there has to be some level of pushing and reform, even at MDB level, for them to really reach that last mile, because and work with institutions like ourselves that are out there that are de-risking the largest industrial parks in Africa today, the transitional metals, as well as renewable energy in Africa. We have a climate adaptation a project for infrastructure. I know Meridian has one for urban. So these are the projects that I think to ensure that money reaches in a very systemic way. I think we've become very siloed in our approach. And there's a lot of second guessing in the system that just needs to stop. If there's a good project, I think we just need to all embrace and really make sure the money flows.
Can I ask you to comment on what you think about IFC Ventures?
Can you speak louder, please? It's difficult to hear you.
Sorry.
Can you speak, I
Can
think,
repeat my question?
can you speak louder as to what you think about IFC Ventures?
Yeah.
I was at IFC for 18 years, so I think the idea was brilliant. And it was very important for there to be an arm within the IFC that can actually channel that early stage equity. But I think the devil in the detail all the time is in the implementation and how money flows through. So it's still using the IFC system of channeling money. So it becomes really burdensome because early stage, you need to take the idea. You don't need a list. You say, these are the things I need to do to de-risk a project. And I got the money with it. At this point, it's not working because the implementation is still within a very large, very complex institution today, and money is not reaching to the project developers. So it makes it very complicated. Hence, I think there is some reform needed there so that the money goes to people like ourselves that are actually on the ground and de-risking these projects quicker. I think it should be more of a fund of funds for people like ourselves.
That's for what you say.
Thank you. Yes.
So Ethiopia Safara from MIGA, and quick reactions, and much of what I will say will be consistent with what you've heard from Nandita. But starting with this question as to the right balance between public goods and poverty reduction, I think it's a mistake to talk about them as if they're mutually exclusive. As a matter of fact, what we're finding, and this is reflected in our country climate and development reports, is that climate and climate change has deep implications for poverty reduction, right? And that there are opportunities to address climate change in a way that will actually assist with poverty reduction. So I think it's a huge mistake to talk about them as if they're mutually exclusive. And we're approaching it within the World Bank Group as deeply connected, right? And we're going to tackle climate change through the prism of poverty reduction. With respect to coordination among the MDBs, I think this is critical. When I joined MIGA 3.5 years ago, I was given the task of developing a partnership function. So I went around and spent time talking to each of the MDBs and IFIs to see the degree to which they are prepared to partner with us, with notable exceptions in the room. It was Nandita and IFC, obviously. It was remarkable to me the degree to which MDBs compete rather than collaborate. We tend to fight over the same pipeline of projects rather than growing the pie of projects. And I think that requires, as you say, coordination at the highest level. There are opportunities for us to actually grow the pie by virtue of bringing our products together to de-risk projects. And we don't operate in that way, right? And I think some coordination would be fantastic. Don't know how easy it will be. I suspect it'll be tough. but potentially necessary. In terms of reliance on one another when it comes to due diligence, I'm a huge fan. In my prior life, I was a regulator, and I coordinated with regulators around the world with respect to the supervision of globally active firms, with respect to the investigation of fraud in the marketplace. I find it interesting how difficult it is to rely within the MDB community on the due diligence that's been done by another organization. And this is a political issue, really, because at the end of the day, what happens if something goes wrong in a project, going to your board to say, well, I relied on so-and-so or so-and-so, that's not going to work, right? So we've got to figure out how we get our boards to be comfortable with reliance across MDBs, right? On our balance sheet, we actually have enough capital, Thierry, to double the size of our portfolio. The real issue is bankable projects. I've been running a series of roundtables, started mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. We brought together governments at the most senior level with our clients to talk about the priorities the governments had and the projects they wanted to see financed with private financing. We had lots of them. The problem with those projects is the vast majority of them were not bankable. I do think it's important for us to figure out if we can actually dedicate some of the public money to project preparation to get the allocation of benefits and risks in these projects calibrated in such a way that private money will flow. And I think that's an important way to actually use the public money if we can, right? And by the way, not limit ourselves to infrastructure. We tend to have interest in project preparation for infrastructure, important, but project preparation more broadly, I think would be enormously helpful. On transparency, I'd be curious as to what more transparency one would be looking for in our projects. We tend to disclose a fair amount in the interest of making sure that we allow for scrutiny of what we're doing and criticism of what we're doing, right? To make sure that we're living up to expectations. But I'd be curious as to the greater breadth of transparency that's being sought, given I heard you mention that. And I'll stop there. Otherwise, I agree with everything Nandita said.
Thank you. Eric.
Thank you. I do hesitate to intervene because I came late, but I think I caught the gist of this. So a few points. So first, what Nandita is saying on the narrative, I think, and you reiterated it. We just published, I'm Eric Bergdorf from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, used to be at EBRD as well. But we just published a flagship on how to think about how to use the climate as a tool to address the fundamental problems of sustainable development. All the things we need to do to get the transition in emerging and developing countries are the things that we are trying to do in terms of, but it's about reforming state-owned enterprises that are today, incredibly exposed in fossil fuels, for example, how to get the state-owned financial institutions to how to get the appropriate technology policies to get in new clean, green technologies into these economies. I think it's very overblown, this conflict. Of course, there are some instances of that, but I think you can tell a very powerful narrative around how this is actually an opportunity, and there will be resources available. I'll give you an example later of how resources for climate can be used to move some of these issues along in the. And so I also agree with, I'm going to agree with everything that Nandita said. I always do, but I think also that MDBs need to do all the above. There's no way we can continue working project by project. It just doesn't work, and in climate space it's just counterproductive, and so we need to work on the policy framework, and we need to. I come from a small, relatively small MDB that is controlled by the emerging countries, and I think we need to bring them along on this journey, and we need to find ways of working on, with them on the policy reform. And it goes back to the point I made before that there's no conflict between sustainable development and climate. There's very, very much less conflict than we think. So I said I would mention an example where I think we can make progress on something that has been an obstacle for sustainable development, and it was mentioned by Creon in terms of the local currency story, because I can say from our perspective, the fact that we are now more or less pushing these green renewable technologies on countries that are, not really wanting them in a way, because I think they haven't really completely bought into the narrative. I'm not talking about everybody, but there are certainly a few countries that are like this. And on top of that, we are putting this huge exposure in foreign exchange. And for me, it's a major obstacle to progress. I think we have now a number of concrete proposals. I was at the dinner last night where I think we created a new IFI for this, but we'll see if it works out. But so that was on the sort of offshore side and building very much on TCX as the basis. I think there's also huge potential for developing an onshore platform that is now kind of circulating as an idea and working across the MDBs. And so this is where I wanted to comment on the connection between MDBs. We're a latecomer into this. We are the largest co-financier of the World Bank and the ADB now. We are completely willing to accept the due diligence and policies of other, and our board. They know they have accepted this and it was part of the construction of the institution from the beginning. I think this is a huge potential, a lot of savings on this, and let's do it. And we can do it now concretely on trying to develop the local currency. Would need for these MDBs to come together in individual markets, working together, creating some, we call it delegated treasury authority that could help protect these countries against the currency risk. Final thing, I'm just joined a commission that's supposed to create a new climate bank. I don't believe in so I joined for that reason. But I think it's a useful thing to have as a sort of framework for thinking about what do we aspire to, and then once we have kind of created that sort of ideal, so Platonic structure, that now how can we take existing institutions and mold them into this? I think that's the way to go, because if we don't set that high goal and that level of ambition, we are not going to shake up. So I worked a lot on the CAP review this year, and I think there are actually much more going on under the surface than we see, but it's been really hard work, and no one knows this more than Franny. But I think there is actually some real progress in at least in some of the institutions, and we should build on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for bringing up the foreign exchange risk issue. That's certainly something we're going to be looking at through our work, and it's not getting a whole lot of attention right now. Appreciate you raising that. Okay, I see a card down there. I can't see a name, and then I see Susanna. Yeah.
If you,
Yeah, Herman? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm Herman Mulder. I'm a retired banker. I'm the initiator of the Equator Principles 20 years ago. I totally agree with, and currently I'm also the chair of True Price. And I think true pricing of products is going to be a very essential element also in the conditionality of projects, but I leave that here just as an idea. I have a few comments in addition to what Nandita said. I think her comments on the narrative is extremely important. I would even emphasize that we should move from net zero to net positive. Regeneration is the mission, because the damage done has to be repaired. That's number one. I have my own favorite SDG, which is SDG 18, leave no SDG behind. And I also would encourage the MDBs to start working with the United Nations on the Summit of the Future next year on the common agenda, that when we have after 2030 a common agenda, it is not just New York and Washington together, but it is a much more inclusive process. And I really emphasize that point, that the Bretton Woods organization, the MDBs, have a very important role to play to make sure that this time it is not voluntary, and that we're going to crowd in the financing sector also into the agenda. I also would like to emphasize, I'm coming from the private sector, and we are in the enviable position in the Netherlands that the pension funds recognize their dual fiduciary duty, which means they have a duty towards the current generations, but also importantly to future generations, which means that they have to invest also in a responsible way into the future agenda from now to 2050 or beyond. And in that touch, I think in that context, I would, Emily, I would encourage us to really start accelerating and prioritizing brief number 2. We have to create new instruments, which are also being applied by European Bank and by EIB and others, which are much more steering on impact, not just reporting on impact ex post, but in the conditionality of financing, steering on impact. And I think that's crucial for crowding in the financial sector, the private financial sector, that we're going to judge projects on the basis of the committed impacts we're making. And I think that's a pretty important point. Lastly, I would like to emphasize, another thing is that I think the MDBs also should help developing countries in facing the dilemmas which are embedded in the SDGs. I'm working with Suriname, and they have an offshore oil field. They also have a pristine nature. So how do we balance them to give the opportunity to develop their own economy, the social programs, and at the same time do the preventive deforestation or finance the reforestation? I was involved in the Yasuni project in Rio +20. That failed, but I think we should think again, and the MDBs can play a role in that, in structuring it and conceiving it. How can we balance these dilemmas within the emerging markets? That brings me to the local markets. I think we should recognize that the MDBs have a very important role to play to develop local capital markets, because that's where the solution must be, and that's why the identity of interest must be. And I just want to echo to emphasize that point. Last point I would like to mention here is we are facing here in the north an enormous resource affordability and scarcity. There will be mining projects developed in emerging markets. How are we going to do that respectively, sustainably? How are we going to ensure that this is not going to a new type of colonialism from us, and there's a fair share? And I'm coming back to my notion on true pricing. I think we need to develop that. So I think the MDBs, and the very last point is, and I emphasize that, there's too much lending already. We should talk about equity. Can I leave it there, Emily?
Yes, I think that's a wonderful comment to leave it on, and one we opened with. I mean, should the MDBs be more focused on lending, or should they start thinking about taking equity positions and thinking more about risk mitigation? I see Susanna and I see Francoise.
Yes, Susanna Gable, Deputy Director at the Gates Foundation and our Development Policy and Finance. It will maybe sound like I don't agree, but I fully agree with what people have been saying. But I do think we need to explicitly talk about trade-offs. Mm-hmm. I do think we need to allow for both a global perspective and a country perspective on these issues. And we need to talk more about the transition approach when we talk about this, both when it comes to the policy priorities and the available financing, not only the amount of financing, but also the type of financing that is available. So climate and poverty reduction, if we take those, absolutely not mutually exclusive, they're deeply connected and all of that. But we still say things like we need to address climate finance, but not at the expense of poverty reduction. But how do we do that and not just say it? So in principle, whenever there is a resource constraint, there are trade-offs. It's per definition. So there may be many co-benefits between poverty reduction and climate, but you will always need to choose between one policy over the other or one project over the others, even if there are co-benefits to both options. So there is always this value judgment in there. And this whole summit is about financing constraints at the global level. And if you ask any minister of finance, they will say there are resource constraints at the country level. And if you ask any business owner or parent, they would say there are financing constraints at the individual level. So we do make trade-offs all the time. And if we don't put them on the table, the practical steps ahead becomes just not as clear. We just launched a report yesterday that proposed a transition framework that then allows for us to both talk about the global goals, but also the priorities at the country level and how they change as countries transition, as well then as the amount of financing available and the type of financing available changes. And these need to then be matched. So whenever we talk about trade-offs, we need to think about what are the priorities for this particular country and what are the available financing, not just talk about it at aggregated level, because it's not very helpful for those that are actually going to make the policy decisions. So in terms of the IFIs, I agree that it's like no question that they need to take on this global agenda because it's here and it's so interlinked with development, but it needs to be translated into what it means at the country level, and not in general, but for different types of countries, because the trade-offs is going to look different. And the same if IFIs are going to take on the mobilizing private capital. Absolutely. I mean, it's, first of all, they've always been in the business of it, right? Even the very grant-oriented money has been about improving the investment climate, and that's the very basic of attracting capital. There's a reason the capital wasn't flowing to begin with. And then to mobilize private capital is just obvious that there isn't enough. And we just need to think about, we have $1 additional of ODA. Should we give it to a country where there is no or very limited alternative financing for basic need, or should we give it to a middle-income country where potentially we can mobilize a massive amount of private resources? It's a very, very difficult question, but the IFIs are the ones that are set up to answer it. I also just wanted to say something about it. You also asked the question about should the IFIs be in business of just financing or actually get involved in the policy discussions. For the choices that are being made at the country level, it's money that you lend out. So obviously you have a say of what the money should be used for. But if it's not aligned with the priorities of the country, it's not going to be efficiently distributed. So it's even if you want to push the climate agenda in a country that prioritizes jobs, let's say, then the climate needs to be connected to the priorities of that country. It doesn't mean that climate shouldn't be part of it, but it needs to be connected to it for pure efficiency reasons. And obviously, it's something that is being discussed a lot for the trust issue and the sense of imposing a policy agenda on other countries. It's not going so well at this point, and we just can't afford it. We can't afford it for policy reduction. We can't afford it achieve the climate goals. Yeah, that's all.
Thanks, Suzanne. I think you raised a really good point in terms of this aggregate level conversation versus country driven conversation that we're really seeing play out with this agenda, I think, right? I mean, the North has been pushing sort of the aggregate level conversation, and the countries in the global South have said, wait a minute, you guys need to listen to us and think about what we need and not just tell us what we need to do at a global level. And I think that's really the tension that we're seeing in this policy conversation right now. So I think that's a really important point to raise. And now how do we move past this? I mean, hopefully the summit is one opportunity to have some dialogue. The shareholders have been mentioned several times around this today, and I think that unfortunately we're missing some of them. They were supposed to be here, but they are at the official summit. But you know, how do we reach consensus when there's really differing priorities? And I think we're seeing that tension just really play out, and we're not making as much progress as quickly as perhaps hoped when this agenda was put forth. Francoise.
Thank you. So I want to start with positive aspects because I think that we are looking back what.
You should remind everyone who you work for.
What?
You should remind everyone who you work for.
Okay, sorry. I'm Françoise Lombard. I'm the CEO of Proparco. So Proparco is the subsidiary of the French development agency that is dedicated to a private sector. Yes, I want to start with positive aspects because I think that a lot of things, positive things, happened over the last, let's say, 5 to 8 years. First of all, climate has become a core strategic objective for all MDBs in development finance institutions dedicated to private sector. Be it in terms of Paris alignment, be it in terms of volume, amount of finance for climate co-benefits projects. So we have to recognize that a lot has been done on that. I'm deeply convinced that also we MDBs and DFIs have two legs. We have the climate leg, and we have to allow more space for also promoting job creation, promoting access to basic services. The core principle is that I don't think that MDBs and DFIs pretend to do the same thing everywhere the same way. And more we should adapt, we should be more country focused. And the new thing for me is that one, to think in terms of transition also, it's really key. And we are probably missing a bit of that indeed. The second aspect, positive aspect, is coordination. So Thierry, who is very direct in saying what is wrong, what is right. I mean, you're right, a lot has still to be done, but a lot has also been done over the last years in terms of sharing some due diligence, some common standards, and this is really good. I think to go further, we need the right regulatory framework, especially to go further in terms of mutual reliance. We cannot share as a regulated entity, financial entity. We cannot share, for instance, credit assessments. This is not possible. Regarding mobilization, I have two comments. The first one, when it comes to risk sharing, probably we are not doing, I agree, enough in that field. But I see more and more space on risk sharing schemes, not on large scale projects, but for promoting startups, entrepreneurship, micro and small enterprise. I think risk sharing agreements are a common schemes now. We are working a lot with financial intermediaries, not so much on lending, but more and more on risk sharing. But for not on large scale projects, really on the final beneficiaries. So I see more space for it. I think that the European Commission with the new EFSB Plus program has made a huge step in that direction, and it's important. In risk sharing schemes are very useful also to circumvent the local currency exposure. I mean, so I'm definitely convinced that we will go more and more in that direction. The other comments on mobilization is that I think we are definitely at a turning point. I think that very soon we will have some targets to not only on gas volumes, but also how much did you mobilize for one public euro or dollar invested in your structure? So I think we are going in that direction, definitely. I really hope that we will have both the targets and the incentives at the same time. I'm not so sure at that time, but I hope it will work together, because we need the right incentives to go in that direction, both from our shareholders, but also from regulators. The green taxonomy is not fitted for what we are doing. EU green taxonomy, and also the prudential framework is not working well for meeting that objective to mobilize more and more private sector. So we have to be vocal together on having a more suited framework, regulatory framework. This is key. This is key for me. Then I want to say about local currency, it's really key. I think we have not made so much progress on that issue, unfortunately. I am a big fan of TCX. I wrote is not here. He's one of he's stuck at Palais Brongniart, because I think it's a good instrument in terms of it's an open instrument. MDBs in DFIs definitely must not create their own local currency instrument. I think we have really to neutralize, pulling together forces in terms of sharing local currency exposure. TCX is that kind of open instrument, but it has to be held up definitely. And regarding a new climate bank, I will definitely share the comments that have already been made, because I think that we have learned that SDGs and are all very intertwined. And now for all MDBs, DFIs, I mean, climate is a cross-cutting objective. It's not an objective itself in all our projects. So I think this is a good way to do it. So I'm not so sure about the signal we would send if we have one dedicated climate bank. What about the other SDGs? And I also think it could maybe add a layer of complexity in financial architecture.
Wonderful, thank you. Ayan, and then I see Veronica and another name that I can't read. Ayan.
Insightful.
Okay, why don't we go, okay. Yep, here.
You go? Okay, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Jean-Xavier Hecker. I work as the head of ESG research within JP Morgan, where I do cover equity markets mostly. So I'm a little far away from the NDB world, but I think I can bring a quite different perspective, especially on the role of the private sector and how much both worlds can work together. I wanted to say a word first on the first question, whether there is a sort of trade-off between poverty reduction and global commons. I totally agree with the people who have said that this should be seen as complementary issues. I think the fact that this question is being asked at the moment in the wake of the cost of living crisis, energy crisis, etc., worries me a little bit, because within the sort of like day-to-day work I do, looking at, for example, earning calls, CEO like speeches, this is increasingly a case where people are saying, okay, we don't need to go too fast on the transition because we need to think about just transition first, but often just transition could be just an excuse to not transition. The second point I want to make from that perspective with regards to what could be the policy role of MDB is on the education side. More specifically, I think the private sector needs to have a much bigger sense of urgency when it comes to climate adaptation and the potential physical risk. Albeit it is everywhere in the media all the time, there is a bit of a like behavioral, like psychological issue on understanding what is really at risk here. What does it mean concretely for stability of political system and economic systems to have like billions of climate refugees? This is nowhere, I think, in the mind of many decision makers at the highest levels of the economy. The third point is on the narrative around whether we should frame the energy transition as an opportunity. I've spent the last 10 years reading sustainability reports from companies, and I've become allergic to sustainability is part of our DNA, and there's a big opportunity there. The energy transition is something that is being imposed to us by pretty much the limits and the planetary boundaries and the ability for humankind and its economic system to actually maintain itself over the long term, which is the primary sense of sustainability. So win-win discourses. Opportunity, to me, is a risk. I've been warning the ESG community on the equity side and fixed income side of the fact in 2017, I wrote that we should beware of win-win discourses, because if we always say that we are going to win with green investment or like sustainable investment, we are simply pretty much going to lose credibility whenever the cycle change and suddenly ESG funds do not perform well. The fact that the anti-ESG movement is rising significantly with legal implication, and we see that for the insurance sector with all the big founder members leaving the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, is a warning sign. Win-win discourse are a risk by themselves. So we need to be very clear on the fact that there are risks and opportunities for steel-making companies in an emerging country. Implementing direct iron reduction is an additional cost, meaning that the price of the steel they produce is going to be less competitive if there is no direct demand created for this green steel. Which brings us to the comment that Herman has done, which I totally agree with, on the true pricing, I think. If there is one area of policy where MDBs could play a higher role, it would be on actually pushing for a revamped accounting system in the world. I mean, the ISSB is obviously working on it, and there are so many players working on it. And I think Herman mentioned dual fiduciary duty. The dual fiduciary duty is the same as the dual materiality concept that is pushed by Europe, which is trying to recognize that we need to consider impact and financial materiality. But the problem is really how we do measure financial materiality. So when I hear that what is needed is a database of projects with like climate benefits sorted by internal rate of returns, that worries me a bit, because to me, what we need is IRRs, which are reflecting the climate risk of each project, creating a level playing field. Obviously, we all know what is the actual likelihood of having a global carbon pricing put in place, but this is always the conundrum that, without naming, we are facing. So working on true pricing, I remember the FSB, when they started on TCFD, that was a game changer. At the end, the TCFD recommendation, they are very much focused on what could be the financial risk linked to climate change, but they are pushing for a long-term horizon. And if you are a long-term horizon thinker, pretty much financial materiality and impact materiality marry themselves. But I really need, and that's so I really think that on the top of having a better sense of urgency through education for decision makers, and also thinking long term, if you want to push for a just transition, which requires trade-off also on the social side, what will be needed is a political acceptance of the transition. Hence, you need to educate people about what could have happened if the transition doesn't happen. So that is really where I think, obviously, MDBs can do a difference. That is, I would say, my contribution to the debate. But I think these are very important things because the private sector, as of now, only looks at internal rate of returns. And even if a green project has an IRR that is positive, they're not going to allocate the money to it if there is a brown project that has a better IRR. And that is the other issue on the top of it.
Thank you. I think it's very important to have the private sector perspective here, and that will segue nicely into Veronica's comments.
Yeah, sure. So Veronica Scotti, I work for Swiss Re, which is one of the largest reinsurance companies in the world. So Emily, I'm just going to keep to 2-3 words, keywords. I think if we look at the fragmentation in the geopolitical context we're in, because I think that's also overlaying a lot of the issues, what would be helpful, and it's maybe too high a toll, but I'll put it out. It's helped to build confidence. And I think there is this middle level between the project by project activities and then the structure. So to me, there is a project level credibility, there is a structure level credibility, and there is a market level credibility. And the issues that what I'm hearing, we're struggling with, but they should be surmountable. And the office being formerly at the SCC, it's one of the things I hammer on. It's great to have good projects, but we're looking for perfection in projects. We want projects to be resolving all of these issues. And and that's why the pipeline looks so thin, frankly. It's because we want incredibly, sainthood out of these projects. When in fact, if projects could just be projects and we are addressing some of the structural issues more at market level or around portfolio approaches or policy approaches, I think we will be lifting off so much of the weight that today falls on projects. So that would be my, I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but I see a couple of heads nodding, so maybe that helps. Now, to the point of MDBs having their own different standards, the way we could try and resolve this very simply is some level of interoperability. 5 years ago, I asked a simple question, why don't you guys all use the same standard? Now I understand it's not possible. We're going to spend another 10 years debating about, 3 or 4 issues of divergence, maybe just having some interoperability and maybe creating a structural level transparency around the project preparation work that has been done means that we are reducing the frictional costs and getting things done faster. So I'm completely with Ayaan that for me, if out of this reform, we could get one thing done is speed to market. I think the private sector that I'm a representative of would love to be bombarded with requests for work. We go out and trying to piece pieces, from various multilaterals. And the reason why we like to work with the multilaterals is because it builds confidence and it helps us, Jean-Javier, with the question of impact as well as financial returns. So I actually I'm not for a single dimension. I'm for the dual materiality. I think as a firm, we are behind it. But it is incredibly difficult at this point to have comparable uniform impact metrics. And so the work that the frictional cost is one of having to figure out at each project level what impact looks like and having to then come up with our own framework. So if I'm working ever more with standard setters because, but these are voluntary standard setters. So whomever can afford to have an independent standard setter evaluate, verify, will do it. But otherwise, there is a lot of projects that simply don't come with this independent verification. So it's, again, an additional cost. So if we can socialize those costs and create incentives for companies like mine to actually look at both, think you will find there is a lot of eager capital that wants to go in that direction, simply struggling to find the confidence to do so. And maybe the last word that I would share is in the document, I commend you, it's the one of the very few documents where I saw someone talking about adaptation. The short conclusion is adaptation doesn't lend itself well to, private capital. Hence, it has to remain into the private capital, public capital world. I'm not fully with you 100% in that recommendation. I think it's very convenient to default to that view. Now, one of the things that I'm trying to do, and I think, you can look at it from a finance perspective. We don't have the time to open the debate around finance for adaptation right here. But I think one of the key problems is adaptation projects are very local. We need to normalize, and I'm a statistician by background, we need to normalize this very different, so the impact framework would really help us do so. To have a normalization framework that allows capital to go there knowing that you are getting certain type of returns that are comparable. And the issue that we also have is that we haven't thought about the non-financial private sector role in this. So it's something that I've been pushing quite a lot. Others have talked about private equity or private money. Well, there is a whole business community that today has real assets invested in the global south. And if we don't work with them to evolve from purely business continuity management concerns that they may have, which frankly will result, all else equal, from money that is invested in, let's say, Caribbean countries to be invested somewhere else where they feel their adaptation risk, related risk, is better managed. So I'm very concerned that we will see a dramatic shift out of the global south because there aren't appropriate strategies on the ground. What we need to, in fact, convince our business partners is that staying in the country and addressing vulnerabilities in their supply chain is actually the right thing to do, because it will help us stabilize market. It will bring more competencies. We cannot change the exposures, and that's my final comment. We can't change the exposures. I can tell you that's what we do. The exposures are there. We can change vulnerability. So by strengthening the resilience of operations, physical risk, supply chain, creating more a closer interaction with local communities, it is very possible to remain invested and attract more investment. But this is not currently in scope, and I wonder whether the multilaterals could work in that direction.
Thank you, Veronica, for your comments. I think in terms of your missing mid-level structure, I think what you're pinpointing is sort of the investment in upstream policies in countries, right? Which is something the IFC has, done historically, but, should the IFIs focus on that country-specific upstream policy environment a bit more? I think that's a very good point to raise, and Ethiopia might have something to say about that.
No, I just want to comment very quickly on a couple of points that were raised since I last spoke. And there was this question as to whether or not MDBs should continue to provide financing, limit themselves to providing advice. And I've never worked on the public sector side. I don't work at the World Bank, and I don't want to speak for them, but I've worked with them. And I think what you will find, what they're likely to say is that advice is best heeded when it's accompanied by financing. And indeed, when it's not accompanied with financing, it tends to get ignored, right? So I'm not sure you can bifurcate the two. I want to join in with Mr. Mulder on the importance of equity. So I worked for a number of years at the IFC before joining MIGA. And we had a significant equity portfolio when I started that reduced over the period of time that I was there because of the volatility associated with equity. In my experience, both, I believe that with debt, you run companies. With equity, you build companies. And what we need most, based on my experience from being from the global south, but also working at IFC, what you need most in these markets is to build companies. Right? So hopefully we can actually push MDBs to do more on the equity side. and potentially less on the debt side. On this debate between the global south and the developed world with respect to climate, that debate takes place in my room every day. Okay. Given the composition of the World Bank Group institutions. And I think my sense is that the consensus has, as an initial matter, landed on looking at the intersection of climate with poverty and financing projects that actually address that intersection of climate and poverty. That's not to say we might not do more, but where it stands now, given that debate, that's where, and not to abandon the country engagement model. I mean, the countries that sit around the table say, we think you need to look at what we need, what our priorities are, what we're dealing with in terms of poverty, and we'd be very keen for you to help us with that intersection between climate and poverty. But don't become an institution that doesn't focus at the country level and that doesn't focus on the poverty challenges we face. And I think that debate is an important one. We need to find the common ground between the two sides.
Thank you. Ayan, last word. And is there anyone else? We'll go Ayan and then to Herman.
Okay. So I definitely am very encouraged. I don't think adaptation is necessarily a non-revenue business. We have looked at adaptation at IFC for infrastructure. And once you de-risk an infrastructure, it's an annuity business. And if we don't climate proof in Africa infrastructure today, we will have issues on the revenue on the cost side. So I think that needs to be better framed. I think, really looking at climate, I also want to come back to the just transition. To us, just transition from an Africa side, it's extremely important. And it's important from the perspective that we have only contributed 4% to the current GHG emission, the current stock. Of that, the top 3 countries, Egypt, South Africa, and few, a little bit, Algeria, few, really represent 70% of that 4%. A lot of them, Morocco, a lot of them are actually making a huge headway to transition. South Africa, we have coal issue, which has no solution because it's very expensive. You have a huge population that still are employed by that sector. So unless you give them severances through grants, there's no way to transition that. So that's a big elephant in the room. But so when you have a region that has contributed so little, yet, we need to look at the global and we need to look at country specific. So when we are speaking about transition, we really need to take a stock of what are the baselines we're working at the country level, at the regional level, and at a sector level. When you look at those baseline, what you'll find is that a huge part of Africa is close to net zero. And then what you have is that the biggest bang for the buck for Africa is really our forests. Some of them are actually on top of huge lucrative gas and oil reserves like the Congo Basin. So there is a trade-off, to come back to what my colleague has said. So how do we incentivize that those forests, which are available for the world, are going to stay there to be the carbon sinks that we need? And that is the Africa's net zero story. So it is not the energy transition because we don't have energy. But in the future, it's better that, as Nandita said, the narrative is let's go clean. We're talking future. We're not talking about the past. So the word net zero transition doesn't apply to Africa. What applies to Africa is that the biggest bang is on forest. So let's not cut further trees. Let's transition the future, but let's create resilience. That is just transition because emissions have no borders. Impact has no border. The way Italy is affected, Mozambique is affected. So in that sense, I feel like we're in one globe that is affected the same, but the contribution is different. So I think that to me is really important. With respect to the climate bank, I really agree with my colleagues Francois and Nandita. I think we do need to focus on making many MDBs have access to climate. Not all MDBs are equal, doing great job in channeling climate finance to where it needs. I mean, we've gotten many lines from Poparco, from, I know EBRD is doing excellent work in northern part of Africa, Middle East. So not all MDBs are equal. We need to look at that very strategically. But the GCF is also unique, despite its complexity in the way it's operating. It is an open system. An NGO can go to it. We as AFC, as a private MDB, we can go to the GCF. We cannot go to Jeff. So whatever is created has to be open, transparent. Whatever we may say about GCF, you will see their debates all over the internet. The operating models hopefully will change as it matures, and some complexity with respect to certain aspects of the way it works and the governance, because of the fact that it's a good thing that both developing and developed side have a say, but at the same time, that comes with a set of complexity because decision-making has been really cumbersome. So I just feel like I really wanted to say about that. The last thing is the issue of, I think Ethiopia's brought up, is that the competition among MDBs, sometimes it's healthy because then they push each other in a way to do more. And competition is good, I think. But I've been at IFC at a time when it really used to push the envelope, 18 years ago. But we were the only game in town. It's not the only game in town now, at the IFC. You have a lot of private sector players out there that are doing very important work. So this concept of crowding out has to be limited. MDBs have free capital. They don't pay dividends. They don't pay taxes. Most are AAA. That's not the same for people like us or others, where our capital, we still have to give return. We still have to get rated. We still have to go to the capital market and borrow. So there is responsibility for MDBs to push the envelope, to do more riskier things, to open market, so to create market. That's why you're the last resort. And that's a very important role that I'm seeing less of in the current states. For example, project preparation. That's an important area to de-risk equity, securitization, first loss. There's a lot of work given the capital and the privileges IFIs enjoy for them to really push the envelope in low and middle income countries. So I think for me, I feel like I would like to see more of that, but they should be not crowding out private capital. Where private capital is doing a great work, please, you don't need to be there. It's not necessary. Also efficiency, I think some of the private players are better mobilizer of private capital. So support them, de-risk them to get the right capital. So I feel like there has to be a distinction in that, in that whole issue. Foreign currency, agreed, that's a big issue. We are in, the European Commission has put together a very important group of around 30 experts to look at all these issues. How do we increase bankable projects in? So we are issuing a report this afternoon. I am the moderator there, and we do touch on some of these things. So I will send it to the group through Samaila. So I just wanted to say that, I still think it's one globe, but there is differences and there are trade-offs. For a country that has no budget for its health system. Most Africans were highly affected by COVID. Countries are all badly rated from COVID impact. Then we had food crisis from Ukraine. So there are priorities. So you'll go to a country and they were like, I don't want to hear about climate because I'm just trying to survive the next rating from Moody's. Just wanted to end with that.
Yeah. Herman, and then Eric, and then we'll close. I'll let Kriyan respond, and I'll share a few of my themes as well. So Herman.
In the earlier conversation, there was some attention paid to the shareholders. And I'm very concerned about what's happening with the outcomes of COP26. I think under pressure, it's the insurance sector, but also the ideas, the net zero insurance alliance, and I think Swiss Re was in it. You see, yeah, is now fragmenting a lot of good initiatives, and I think I'm very concerned about what's happening, particularly from the shareholder in the United States, that there's so much legal pressure on companies who are well intended, which feel for legal reasons to step out. I think We should not be only dependent on shareholders. There should be leadership on the NDBs to have a global agenda, and not just and really be an activist in that respect to convince governments to stick to the outcomes of earlier conferences. I'm very concerned about the political development. That's number one. Number two is that there is a capacity problem, not only in the real economy, but also in the financial sector. When I did structured finance at ABN AMRO Bank in the last part of, say, the 80s and the 90s, there was a lot of capacity. There was a lot of excitement to do together with IFC and with the other MDBs to a lot of structured financing in the South. That capacity isn't existing anymore. It's a compliance culture in the banking sector. It is Basel III, which is limiting the possibilities for the banking sector to be active. Pension funds, who are typically the long-term investors, don't have the capacity either. We need to create excitement. That's why, again, I think it's extremely important that the private sector is going to be crowded in with incentives and de-risking instruments into the global agenda. And we have in the Netherlands ILX, SDX was mentioned already. ILX is in met Manfred Schepers is another example where secondary transactions from the NDBs are being repackaged, securitized, and sold to pension funds. They now are at 2 billion almost. And the problem is not to get to the 3, because there's a lot of appetite for that. But there are other creative instruments which can be developed. And the last point is, on your point, I think impact assessment, just have a look at the impact weighted accounts, which we have been creating with Harvard Business School, where we are really looking at across all the issues, all the SDGs, with the ESG baseline, also within planetary boundaries that hasn't been mentioned yet. Look at the impacts which projects should make and can make. Thank you.
Eric and then Patricia. Oh, Patricia first. Yep. So I'm Patricia Torres. I work for Bloomberg and I manage our product for ESG. I just wanted to say that there's a lot of really interesting comments. The first one is this is an opportunity of $200 trillion. And our Bloomberg New Energy Finance Research Group has written a paper that says for every dollar we invest in brown, we need to invest 4 in clean energies. And the question is, can we ask the banks and the private sector to start disclosing that ratio? What's your ratio that you are actually doing between brown and green? The second thing is Bloomberg, we're trying to help customers understand how countries are migrating towards 1.5 degrees. And it's really interesting to see the NDCs and NGFS, and then how all these different projects actually align with the country's commitments to go to 1.5. I was with IOSCO last week, and one of the things that I ask is, if you had the opportunity to actually be a regulator around the world, who would you want to be? And the answer was, I don't want to be a regulator because their job is extremely difficult. But there's one thing that I don't think we're doing well, which is we're not linking projects with NDCs. We're not linking projects with unconditional funding or conditional funding. And I think is that we're all running around like, oh, let's create more projects. But these projects has to be aligned with the local context. So, for example, in Brazil, people have a big issue with transport. In London, we have building. In other countries, you have power. So which project should we be launching for each particular country? Because that's where they have the biggest difficulty. The other thing that I also heard yesterday, actually, at another meeting, was about there are certain projects that have a higher rating than the country. So they are projects that are actually really successful. Where is the database? You know, how do we learn from those best practices, case studies, and how can those case studies be shared? What policies at a country level are required for transport? What policies are required for power transition? What incentives, assurance? Who are the parties? What is the ratio between private and public? Rating labels, which projects are out there and how strong are these projects that the private sector can come in and then get out? How do we secure the investment on those projects? FS risk management, so the currency risk, because if I'm a US investor, I need to ensure that if I'm investing in an African country, like I'm not going to be losing my money or the money's not going to be stuck in that African country. How do I ensure that there is a proportionally of just transition? So i.e. the project needs to employ certain percentage of local community to really push that investment forward. And which ministries or ministers should be involved? I was asking the question, say, okay, if you want to push this project, who do you speak at a particular country? people say, is it the Prime Minister? Is it the Minister of Environment? Is it the Minister of Finance? So there's not a clear indication when you have a project, which ministers in a particular country do you really have to bring to the table to truly ensure that the project is quite successful. I think the other thing I wanted to talk about is output and outcome. And I think we talk a lot about doing loads of things. The question is, are carbon emissions rising or falling? And the true reality is that they are rising. We are probably just now at 1.5 degrees already, even though we thought the 1.5 degrees probably will be reaching maybe by 2030. So I also feel that it's important to understand which projects have the highest impacts. If you want to reduce carbon emissions, we need to think about coal, we need to think about methane emissions. And of course, we need to think about renewables. The renewables project have a big problem, which is how many years does it take from when you have an idea to make sure that that idea is implementing and actually generating gigatons of electricity? Sometimes that time horizon takes 8 years. We don't have the time. So it's not just the time between you putting a project into place. It's actually the time that it takes from the start, from the generation of the idea to actually get that electricity being generated. And I think we're focusing our time on the project, not the time of the electricity being like generated. I think the other thing I wanted to say is that Bretton Woods started in 1944. Next year is 2024. And I also think that we have the opportunity to really mark the 80-year anniversary. So I don't know what the Bretton Woods Committee is thinking about the 80-year anniversary, but I think we all agree that changes need to be provoked into the economy. So I think I'll really love to hear more about what your intentions are to really mark such an important milestone in the change of the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Yeah, we can talk a bit more about that offline, but certainly want to use the 80th as a time to push forward on the agenda. Eric, final comments from you, and then
Yeah,
and I will.
Because and Nandita started with the narrative, and I think what you said now, Jan, is I think the narrative looks a little bit different depending on where you are. I agree that Africa is different, and my current experience is Asia, where I think what I said before is generally true, that everything we want to do, or not everything, but a lot of what we want to do to promote climate is also consistent with sustainable development more generally, including, by the way, the poverty reduction and all the things, the systemic changes that we need to get sustainable changes in poverty reduction, or to get something that we can are also things that will help us on the climate agenda. I understand where Susanna is coming from, having worked in development agencies, for a long time and seen from that perspective. I think when you come out there now, it's going to be, the reality is there's a lot of capital that could potentially go into these countries. And if there's not reform in the climate space, this capital will not come. That's what I meant when I said before, that this is a huge opportunity now, because there is potential. If countries start implementing some of these policies, the likelihood that they will get access to capital, yes, increases. And here I think these various country platforms that are now being tried out they are still, work in progress, but they are, I think that's the right way to think about it. And that's where you start linking, concrete objectives. And it's not about imposing objectives. These are commitments that countries have made under the NDCs. And I agree very much with the point of linking that. And if you take something that Andita knows much better than I, but the Egyptian platform, for example, which is not maybe moving as quickly as we would like, but the basic objective there is to say that here Egypt has made certain commitments as NDCs, and here are certain ways in which we can offer them opportunities to make it more credible and give them access to cheaper finance, because they have made this commitment. They have now a way of credibly committing to that, reducing the likelihood that they will deviate. So this narrative is not only important for getting change in country, but it's really about having a narrative that will attract the capital to these these countries. So maybe I'll stop there. But I think this was hugely, I learned a lot from this conversation. So thank you.
I think this is a fascinating conversation, a lot to digest. I'm trying to think about how to best summarize. Maybe I'll let Creon start.
Well, first of all, thanks very much. I mean, there's an enormous amount there, lots to think about. I wanted to just make 3 or 4 points. I mean, this is a collective report. Not everything in it does everybody necessarily the same weight on, but I just wanted to come back on 4 points. Firstly, the question of risk sharing. Absolutely agree that MDBs should do more. I also agree that they should do things that the private sector cannot do. What I really worry about is the experience we had in the UK with public-private partnerships. You know, there is a real problem when you go in there and you don't have a proper market that you can start offering risk sharing and you can really get taken for a ride. So, you know, and when you do that and you're not using your public finance for the other things, like leveraging in, you know, the end of hydrocarbon subsidies, all that kind of thing, and then you have a problem. Secondly, on coordination. So, I mean, I spent a lot of time representing quite a big shareholder. And I think there is sort of between the people working at the ground level who are trying to coordinate and the shareholders are up there saying, just get on with it, get on with it. There is, I think, a bit in the middle. I think if the you know, president and the managing director and so on got together, they could get a common taxonomy across the MDBs. And the shareholders would say, great, go for it. So I do think there is some bit of coordination in the middle.
We do actually, I think, an agreement on the taxonomy.
Well, maybe a good example of what can be done, but in the other areas that were cited, which are missing. The complexity, so I started where many of you did on the idea of a climate bank. Afsana convinced me basically that this was a way to do some of the things you need to do very quickly and then spread them out into the wider institution. So very much as, you know, Eric is going to play a role in the commission that you're joining. But, you know, all the points you make about extra complexity and so on, I share. Finally, just on insurance and adaptation and so on. What I really worry, is this an insurance problem? Or is it actually the fact that these countries are going to face a whole series of catastrophic events which are not insurable? Basically, they're going to have to build, if they don't build the infrastructure first to protect themselves from it, this is just loss after loss after loss. So I do think we need to think carefully about what is insurable. With that, I will stop, but I could say, much more.
Add a couple of things on. Just to clarify, I think on the EMS perspective, there is clear interoperability between the
MDBs, yeah.
They pretty much use the IFC standards, and so we should be clear on that. It's not that bad. They certainly don't share credit assessment, but they share environmental and social assessment fairly well. Adaptation, I think it's not only a disaster for the country. I think from a private sector perspective, it is a physical risk, a long-term risk, and I think I would disagree that the arbitrage is done very quickly on return only by short-term investors. Longer-term investors actually include physical risk and adaptation because they certainly don't want to be with stranded assets or assets that lose their revenue later on. And it is possible to invest full money into adaptation. We do it. We help it with some philanthropic, with the Rockefeller Foundation, for example, in many cases, but there are business models for adaptation. And of course, adaptation, when you do it earlier than when the disaster happened, is always better. Just those two things that was.
Thank you, Thierry. Yes, thanks for wrapping us up. And I think Creon hit on.
I'm sorry, Emily, may I make one comment for the comfort of Creon? Sorry, Emily. You should rename your climate bank into a carbon sink bank.
Yeah, I do think I share the name, the nomenclature issue with this idea. I think it the way that it's framed, it sort of initially draws skepticism, but as Kriyan said, actually, when we think about the idea a bit more, it does make sense and we have been convinced. But I think we need to make sure it's framed appropriately. I'm just going to wrap up with a few comments. I think Kriyan did a good job on most of the sort of climate specific issues. I'm going to take it up a little bit in terms of some of the architecture issues that were raised today. I mean, I think certainly this conversation about the narrative and not being this trade-off of poverty reduction and global commons came through very clearly. We have to consider what the trade-offs are, but we have to interlink them and think about framing it as an opportunity. That came through very clearly. But then we have to connect the aggregate to the country level and make sure that those opportunities are being connected to, country specific policies, priorities, NDCs, et cetera. So I think that's a big input for our multilateral reform work. The second, sort of this bankable project issue that seems to be a perennial issue. I mean, how do we really create a pipeline of more bankable projects? How do we invest in the project preparation, sharing information, coordinating across institutions, and investing in sort of upstream policies in countries to really ensure that pipeline of bankable projects? We've talked about shareholder consensus several times. I mean, how do we push them? How do we push towards convergence? So everyone's ideas and priorities are getting heard and being met, not just getting heard, but being met. And perhaps in the absence of there being consensus at the shareholder level, the IFI management can do some pushing in that regard, which I think has been mentioned a few times around the table, that they actually need a bit more authority and a bit bigger voice. We can't just say, oh, it's only the shareholders and they won't agree and they're never going to agree. We've got to figure out how the IFI leadership can push them towards convergence and consensus. The MDB sort of coordination, streamlining, we've talked a lot about that, but I think the overarching point is making sure they're not competing. And the whole point of our sort of architecture work is to look at the various institutions and ensure that they are all playing a unique role. There is no competition, that they all serve a purpose. So certainly take that point. And then finally, just on sort of risk sharing, I think broad support for investing in more risk mitigation instruments, MDBs taking on more work in that regard, but making sure that we do that and avoid moral hazard with sort of public funds in doing so. I'd say that's my main takeaways. Just want to thank everyone for really a fruitful discussion here. A lot for Kriyan and I to take back to the working groups to share on the work. I thought we had a really wonderful cross section of representation from the MDBs themselves and their private sector arms, from civil society, from philanthropy, from the private sector. We were just missing the shareholders who all got stuck. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Yeah, we'll make sure they get the notes. Thank you all very much.